Let's go through a shareholders agreement. And first of all, a disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, so this is not professional legal advice. So bear with me. And first of all, a shareholders agreement is a document that regulates the relationship between the shareholders in a company, typically a private company, because once you are a public company and your your shares are traded on a stock exchange, you cannot have a shareholders agreement that everyone needs to sign all the time. It wouldn't be practically impossible. So a shareholders agreement is a very, very useful document, but first of all, first and foremost, used in private companies. And the point is sort of that everyone who's a shareholder signs the shareholders agreement so that there is a common understanding of how things are supposed to be um, dealt with. Now, what things are in a shareholders agreement, you might ask? Well, I mean, there are laws regulating what you can and cannot do with companies. But nevertheless, I mean, if you look back at when a company is formed, a company is founded by a group of people, the founders, who might or may not have a shared vision of where they want to take this company. The point is that, well, unless stated otherwise, the only thing that you can work with is your ownership in the company when it comes to decision making. So if you're not agreeing on something, um, the one who can gather the most shares or the most votes will decide. Sometimes you want to decide in advance how things are going to play out if you're not agreeing on something. And you want to also make sure that you state explicitly what it is that you're doing with this company, and that's the purpose of the shareholders agreement. So we're going to go through some parts of the shareholders agreement template provided by the company Startup Tools, although this is not in any way limited to startups. It can be used in many different companies. It is, however, written for Swedish law. So many of the clauses in here are applicable in other jurisdictions too, but it's worth noticing. So let's go through some of the things in the shareholders agreement. So first of all, there are a bunch of yellow placeholders here where you can change numbers and that the creator of this document has sort of set up so that because you might want to do it in slightly different ways sometimes, but so that therefore there are some templates, some template placeholders here in yellow. So, but just to walk through briefly, what does a shareholder agreement contain? Well, you have a bunch of parties, so basically the shareholders will, and you have a list of shareholders who are signing or supposed to sign the agreement. Some of them are referred to as, for instance, founders or key persons. Um, they can be physical persons, they can be companies, but nevertheless, there's a point here that the people who are referred to as founders are later on given special consideration in this agreement. Same goes for key persons. Sometimes you also see investors here, so that if the investors might have some separate clauses for that. So these are the parties. There are some facts about the company, and there are some definitions of terms used in the agreement. We might mention the adherence agreement, which is a thing that you sign if you become a shareholder at a later point in time. And instead of everyone signing a new shareholders agreement, you can just, as a new shareholder, sign the adherence agreement, and so that's worth mentioning. We're gonna skip over most of this here, the definitions, and then go into section 2 called financing, capital increase, dividend, and adherence. So this regulates, this is basically putting in writing what the shareholders agree should be the way forward when it comes to financing this company. So we're writing out here that if, for instance, we are issuing new shares, everyone will have the right to participate uh, with the same percentage, at least the same percentage as they are currently owning. So if we are bringing in new capital and you own 10%, you have the right to take 10% of that new investment round, even though you might not want that, and then you will be diluted, but you have the right, and that's sort of stated here. And there are some exceptions to that, such as when you issue new shares for employees, etc. But that's sort of the general clause. There's also a clause here saying that you are not forced to put in extra money into this company unless you want to. That's 2.1 here. So that's a thing that the shareholders agree on here as well. Here there's a long clause here, and this I would be a bit hesitant about this if I were to sign this agreement. It basically says that if shareholders representing at least 2/3 here, in yellow, of the shares vote to do a financing round and bring in investors, for instance, everyone will have to sign the new shareholders agreement and the investment agreement associated with that financing. And we don't know what's in that agreement. So if you're signing this, you might be voted. Someone else might vote in a way that so you have to sign a new agreement, and there are some exceptions here around it, but still, I would be hesitant about that. I would probably put that number to be a bit higher. It also says here that the income, the profits from this company should be reinvested. It doesn't say explicitly reinvested. It says that the funds accrued shall be used primarily for the development of its operations and the expansion of the business. This is an important thing. The shareholders here, they are agreeing that they don't want dividends, first and foremost. They want profits to be reinvested to grow the value of the company. And that's a very important statement to put in a shareholders agreement, because that sort of sets the basis for the operations going forward. It says something is about new parties and etc. But we'll jump to point 3 about the board. Here it states what the board should look like. So the shareholders agree that every one of the founders. I mean, you remember that there were some shareholders that were called founders, and every founder shall be able to elect one member, and that could be themselves. And otherwise, you can put in some numbers here saying how many people should be in the board and how often the board should meet, etc. There are also in section 4 here something about information rights, and this basically is for the founders. If a founder, for instance, leaves the company and is no longer involved in the operations, he or she still will have some right to information about the company, and that's sort of stated here in 4.1. And that's a common thing to have in shareholders agreement. There is also a section here about where you have to have something called founder majority, and that is actually defined further up in the agreement. So some decisions in this company are not to be taken, for instance, in a general meeting, unless there is a founder majority behind those decisions. So even though there might be a majority of the owners who want to sort of change the rights of the shares, as it says in point B here, or declare or pay dividends, every shareholder agrees here that type of decision requires a founder majority. So these are and in a later point in time, if this company brings in minority investors, for instance, such as venture capitalists, they would want something similar, where investor majority is needed to make certain types of decisions. And this is to protect their minority interests as investors. So, for instance, if a founder has brought in investors and then wants to substantially increase their salary, um, that will be typically be a thing that will require an investor majority to protect the investor's interest. And it says here in point D, there's a similar clause where it comes to founder majority. There's a section 6 dedication here where it says that the key persons should be devote their full time to the company. A very similar thing to a very sort of common thing to have in shareholder agreements in general. That if you're a founder, if you're a key person, then you're supposed to work full time here, and that we agree on that here, and everyone signs it. Point 7 or section 7 is an important one. It states that the parties, the shareholders here, have an intent to sell the company. A sale or an IPO. I mean, you can never force this. If there's no buyer, there's no buyer. But it clearly states an intent, and combined with the fact that the intent is to reinvest profits. I mean, this is a shareholder. This is an agreement among shareholders that we're building a company that is not to be a cash cow that gives out dividends. This is a company that's meant to be built and sold. So these are important clauses to have in there. Then we come to an important section, transfer of shares. And these might look different in different companies, but some important common terms here is things like right of first refusal, and and there are different versions of these clauses, but basically what they're all about is to prevent anyone from just selling their shares to for instance, a competitor. And you would have clauses here saying if someone wants to buy your shares, an external party, you'd have to offer the shares to the existing shareholders first. That's a very common clause, and this is to control who gets to be an owner in this company. Also, you might have things in a shareholders agreement called a drag-along right or a tag-along right. And this is also to, for instance, protect certain groups of shareholders. A drag-along right is basically saying that, well, let's say there is an external party who wants to buy the company, and you have one small shareholder who doesn't want to sell. Well, then here it says, you see there's a placeholder here, if 2/3 of the shares or shareholders representing more than 2/3 of the shares wish to accept that offer, they can drag along the remaining shareholders to sell. So that there will be a deal. And this is typically a good thing, because then you can ensure that a company gets sold even if there's a stubborn shareholder not wanting to sell. On the other hand, sometimes this can be a problem if you are a minority investor and you have invested on a high valuation, and then someone comes along and says, well, I want to buy the company for a lower valuation, and you get dragged along. Typically what you would have then is some kind of veto right, in accordance to what we saw before, preventing this drag along right, so that that type of decision requires an investor majority. But a similar thing or a different version of this is called a tag along right. And if drag along is something, it is a clause saying that you can drag along other shareholders to sell along with you. Tag along is basically saying, if someone sells, I want to be able to sell too. So if there's an external buyer saying, I want to buy 60% of the company, well, then if there's a tag along right, well, they can't just go to some shareholders and buy only their shares. Everyone gets to sell 60% of their shares in that scenario. So that's a very important thing. I've seen cases where minority shareholders get nothing where there's a transaction and there is no tag along right. So someone just buys a majority from a few shareholders and some get left with nothing. Then there are some exempt transfers from these clauses. And then there's a section 9 called vesting. And this is an important thing to have in place in startups, for instance. So if you're starting out with a company with some friends, not everyone perhaps is as sure about the idea, and they might have different resilience when it terms the different levels of resilience when it comes to sort of fighting the startup fight. And if someone leaves after 1 year, perhaps they shouldn't be able to keep all of their shares. So a vesting scheme basically says, well, you earn your shares over a certain period of time, and if you leave prematurely, the other shareholders get to buy your shares, perhaps at nominal cost, or but in some cases slightly higher, depending on what has happened in the company. Um, there's something here called good and bad lever, and that's a common thing to have in a shareholders agreement. And you have different versions of this. A bad lever would typically be someone who leaves leaves the company for a reason that they can help, so to speak. So whereas a good leaver might be someone who um, gets sick, or they can't help it, they have to leave, sort of. Um, and different shareholders agreement will have different definitions of this, but typically a bad leaver will have to give up shares at a lower price than a good leaver will. Sometimes a good leaver might even be able to keep all of their shares, or parts of it. So good leaver and bad leaver are two common shareholder agreement terms. And then you would have clauses stating how should these shares be valued if the good or bad leaver is forced to sell shares. You also have a section here called redemption of shares, and this regulates if someone, for instance, breaches this contract and um, gives out secrets to a competitor, or does something that is this materially bad for the company and really goes against the will of this shareholders agreement. There are clauses here stating that how he or she will lose their shares. um, Sometimes there might be even a criminal or legal action taken against that person as well, but um, and then finally there are things like and I should mention here, change of control is an important clause. It says that if you, for instance, own shares in a company through a holding company, and then uh, you sell your holding company to someone else, when then the company has actually indirectly gotten new shareholders, and that's called a change of control of the holding company, and that will be regulated. So the holding company might actually lose their shares. Um, and further down here, there are things like valuation of shares and non-compete clauses saying that you, as a shareholder, cannot compete in any way with this company. You cannot sort of take key employees out of the company, etc., etc. Then shares might be redeemed, or there are clauses around the intellectual property in the company. There are clauses around the term of this agreement, um, around confidentiality, and how changes to this agreement shall be made, um, and how we communicate with each other as shareholders within the realm of this agreement, and which and how and where we discuss problems that we might have with each other within sort of this agreement. In which country should we have that dispute? In which court, etc. And then you sign the agreement. Again, this is not legal advice in any way. So the point here is just to give you an overview of what types of things are in a shareholder agreement, and make sure that you've seen that at some point. So please, if you at some point become a shareholder in a company that has a shareholder agreement, make sure to talk to a lawyer and get professional assistance in that. Thank you.